in the future. So I do want to welcome everyone for this webinar. Thank you for joining today's webinar that addresses specific considerations for food businesses as they continue to reopen after the devastating storm in Western North Carolina. So my name is Lynette Johnston. I'm an assistant professor and food safety extension specialist here in the Department of Food, Bioprocessing, and Nutrition Sciences. I'm also joined by food safety extension associate, Kate Nicholas, who will be helping with logistics and sort of the behind the scenes conversation in the chat. So whether you're a restaurant owner, a food processor, or operate a fresh produce pack house, the damage left behind a storm can be overwhelming due to a multitude of factors that must be considered. So from cleanup to restoration and construction to regulatory compliance, I'm sure there are a lot of questions. So because of this, the format of this webinar will be a discussion. It's not necessarily a presentation, but this is about you. We want the emphasis to be about our audience, the needs and the resources and the questions that you have. So during this webinar, we welcome your questions both as feel free to, interrupt the conversation. We don't see that as an interruption, or feel free to include your question in the chat, okay? We will certainly get to each and every question that is addressed. So without further ado, I definitely want to thank our experts that have joined us this morning. And I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Grinstead to first introduce himself, and then we'll pass that on to both Brendan and Josh. Thank you for being here, gentlemen.
Well, thank you very much. That's my pleasure. My name is Dale Grinstead. Like it says in the slide, I'm a predominantly retired food microbiologist. I spent about 30 years working in the sanitation industry, supporting all sorts of food operations, food processors, grocery stores, restaurants, contract caterers, big commercial kitchens, et cetera, through any number of food safety issues and post-disaster. After Katrina, I spent some time in New Orleans. After Sandy, out on the East Coast, et cetera. So unfortunately, this is something that happens all too frequently, and I'm happy to help and provide any information that I'm able to.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Lynette, again. My name is Brendan Rumsey. I'm the owner of Rumsey Construction and Restoration. We're a full-service restoration company in the Carolinas, licensed general contractor in the area as well. We specialize in these type of events. So anytime there's flood, water, sewage, and fire. So we're glad to be part of this discussion, and thanks again.
Thank you.
I'm Josh Smith. I am the technical director at PHC Restoration in Lillington, North Carolina, which is directly in the middle of the Fayetteville and Raleigh areas. I am responsible for training, large loss, and any technical projects here. And I hold an unlimited building contractor's license in the state of North Carolina.
Great. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, this is a discussion-based webinar, okay? We do have an agenda with about 8 or 9 slides. These slides will be used merely as a guide for the conversation. So these topics include anything from safety, so considerations that you must think about even before beginning your restoration or your reopening process. We'll also, or the experts will also talk about assessments. What are those questions that should be considered upon reopening a food business? We'll also talk about what to do with your food stock and those considerations from a regulatory perspective. And I see that we do have attendees from several agencies, so I appreciate our participants joining from our regulatory agencies. To talk about mold control as well, a huge factor to consider there. And then we'll also talk about the sanitation aspects of reopening, getting into that 3-step process from clean to disinfecting to sanitizing. And what are those differences? And what considerations do we have to think about for food contact surfaces. And finally, and most importantly, I think, is to remind everyone that no one is out there alone, that there are resources, there are individuals that you can contact for help. So without further ado, I want to hand it over to our experts to lead this conversation. But again, I remind everyone, feel free to turn on your camera, turn on your microphone. Feel free to ask those questions either verbally or include your question in the chat. I remind everyone that this is about our audience and the help that might be needed. All right, gentlemen, I'm going to turn it over to you to go through our first topic, including safety.
Thank you, Lynette. You know, one of the things I think that people need to definitely remember is when you're working with floodwaters or areas that's been flooded, people don't realize sometimes just how nasty floodwater is. I mean, if you think about it, every cow pasture, every sewage treatment plant may have been flooded in the area, outhouses, dog parks, you name it. And it's all going to be floating around in that water. So the material that you're trying to clean up is inherently extremely hazardous. It's also filled with physical debris like broken glass and rusty old nails and all that kind of stuff. So you really need to be aware of all that and keep that in mind. Things like PPE, you know, heavy duty shoes is probably not a job to be doing wearing flip flops and tennis shoes. It's a nice way to nail yourself to a piece of scrap lumber. And kind of related to all that, it wouldn't be a half bad idea to have a tetanus booster and maybe even a Hep V or a Hep B vaccine before you start all this, because this is really some fairly nasty stuff.
And I would say too, is as eager as everyone is to get things back to normal, safety comes first. You know, we don't, like you was saying, catching hepatitis wouldn't be a fun episode for sure when you're trying to get your place. So you're getting coveralls if you can find them, like boots, gloves, respirators, if accessible. Those are very, very important when working in these environments.
I would also add in the electrical components. Oftentimes, services are now being brought underground, and you're not always positive if you don't see power lines above. Sometimes that power is below, and it still can be hot, and you have energized surfaces. Sometimes your building may still have power on it. And so you just want to be really careful of the environment that you're working in before just trying to, see where you are. Doesn't do any good if you can't stay alive long enough to fix the building.
And I would reiterate sanitizing your hands. So again, people are taking breaks, lunch, coffee, when we're working hard, we like eating. So again, it's a small thing, but making sure we wash those hands before we take our breaks. That's very important as well.
And, a live power line may not look live. It's not necessarily going to be flailing around and sparking and glowing and all that kind of stuff. And it's particularly if you have multiple people working on the site, you may be in one area and for all you know, somebody else has just flipped a breaker or something thinking, I wonder if this still works. The next thing you know, a power line may suddenly get energized and you don't realize it. So extreme caution is definitely warranted for all this procedure.
Yeah, such good points and good reminders about the electrical hazards. I think, I've heard stories about the equipment that is lost, or the equipment when you lose that power. It's running when the power goes off, but what happens when the power is restored? I've actually heard of fires occurring because of that. So great points about the electrical hazards. Any questions from our audience bringing up, or, important points to consider as well from maybe what you've experienced, or just questions that you may have? All right, well, let's move on to the next topic. And remember, feel free to ask questions at any point or when you might think of them. So next topic here is assessment. So thinking about those questions that you want to just ask yourself as you're beginning to walk through your establishment. You know, Josh, Brendan, I know you guys have a lot to say on this in this regard. So any key points here that you think of when doing an assessment?
I would say, you know, first off the bat, I go back to safety, making sure, you know, if there is asbestos survey on the property, obtaining that. If not, getting the proper testing to check for any hazards. Again, we talked about electrical, but also asbestos. It's a regulated material that is in a lot of building still, and any lead as well. So those are kind of things we want to think about, especially after a flood, when you have down ceiling tiles or drywall that needs to be removed. So that's a very important step. Again, you know, we want to be quick to get our properties back in line and get our businesses back functioning, but we have to be very careful because we don't want to do anything that could cause long-term damage to our health or our employees' health as well.
One of the things I think to keep in mind too during the assessment is the type of equipment that you have. If the equipment is basically a food contact surface, something like a mixer or a blender, maybe a bandsaw in a meat facility where you're cutting meat, slicer, refrigerator, cooler. Some of that stuff, if it's been exposed to floodwaters, may not be recoverable. You know, as much as you may want to recover the equipment that you have, because that floodwater is, as we said earlier, is so toxic, potentially toxic. It can be very difficult to try and recover some of that equipment. So you need to take a very, I guess, analytical view to this when looking at that equipment, and take a very sort of objective view to, do you really want to try and recover the equipment, or is it best just to write it off? And in many cases, if it's a food contact piece of equipment, your best bet may very well be just to write it off.
Yep. I would kind of recommend, once you're there, take photos. Very few people, I think, would not have some type of smartphone, even a flip phone, I believe, will take a camera, will take a photo, but just take photos of the way things are when you arrived. Once it's safe enough and you can get in, just take photos. What that'll allow you to do is kind of document what you can't remember. Because once you start and you deem that it's safe and you start moving things out of the property, you may not be able to get a restoration company or a professional in for days. And so if you're trying to help yourself and do something, help yourself by documenting the way it was before. That just always is a great idea to do on your assessment.
And for things like HVAC systems in particular, this last comment about not being afraid to get help, I think is really important. Because remember, HVAC isn't just, you know, the AC compressor or the furnace, it's the duct work and everything. And you can't necessarily tell if duct work is good just by looking into a vent. You know, you may need some specialized equipment, some cameras to run down it, that kind of stuff. So HVAC assessments, to my mind, almost have to be done in partnership with a professional who knows how to handle this kind of stuff.
Now, I would say too, you know, once you do find damage at your property, I think Josh made this point the other day in our discussion, is reaching out to the health department to get that conversation started. The sooner the better. Again, I think we mentioned before that, you know, people are scared to make that call, you know, because their business is down, but the sooner you get working with them, they're going to be a resource for you as well to kind of move things forward in the right direction to get back up and running.
Yeah, absolutely. I think local health departments could be tremendous partners with this. It's something like this, you know, this is not something that Western North Carolina faces on a regular basis. And a lot of this is going to be a learning curve for everybody. And to be honest, you'll be better off as a food operator if you learn all this along with the health department, who's Those personnel are probably learning some of this too, and working together can really ease things along, particularly when you're done with the whole recovery process and are ready to reopen. If you've been walking this path along with the health department, it will make the reopening process much, much easier because they're aware of everything you've done.
Yeah, I want to point out, that it's such an important point. And actually, we do have two experts within those agencies, Shane Smith and Joan Sims. Shane Smith with the Department of Health and Human Services with North Carolina, and Joan Sims with the North Carolina Department of Ag and Consumer Services. It looks like they're in our audience. So if anyone has any questions, or Shane or Joan, I welcome you both to, give any sort of tips or any information that you'd like to share.
Hey, Lynette, this is Shane. I just dropped a link into the chat. Hope everybody can hear me well. I'm just getting back in from a conference, so
You're
kind of
great.
double work for a little bit here. But yes, we've since the beginning we've been deploying staff and working around the clock trying to help facilities get back open. We have a toolkit that includes everything from emergency operating plans that can be filled out for facilities that are operating with an emergency water plan or how to open back up, mold guidance, facilities beyond food, including hotels, also swimming pools, spas, tattoo facilities. So all those facilities that have been compromised or had impact due to the storm, we've been trying to get guidance out and work with the local health departments with any kind of questions, especially with industry. If you open up that toolkit, you also see there's a hotline that we've had since the beginning of the storm that folks can call, and we also have an email address so they can email questions. So we're here to be a resource and try to help open up as quickly as possible, but also, like everyone's saying on their webinar today, to make sure it's done safely and that food safety is, of course, at the forefront. That when you do open back up, you're ready to go and contribute to the help that your community needs. So I'm here to help with any questions if you have any.
Great. Thank you, Shane.
We also have some things in place as far as having to help get people open and up and running. My suggestion would be to anybody that would like to do that, to give our office a call, and I can drop our number in the chat, and we can discuss with you how we're helping people try to get open back up also.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Joan. And again, Joan's with the North Carolina Department of Ag and Consumer Services. So good to have you both on the call for sure. So gentlemen, anything else to say about assessments? All right. And if there's any questions, feel free to include them in the chat or feel free to speak up. So I think this is an important point to make here of what to do with your food, that's been impacted by the flood or the damage caused by the storm.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is one of the things that people kind of least want to hear, I think. But an awful lot of your stock, you're simply going to have to dispose of it. The FDA has some fairly strict requirements. If the food is fresh, if it's in a container that may have something like a screw cap or flip top lids, anything like that, because the flood waters, if it was exposed to flood water, can migrate along those sorts of closures and get into the food. Anything packaged in plastic, paper, anything like that, you really have to dispose of it. If it was in contact with food waters, that food is not recoverable. You can't somehow make it safe again. You don't have to dispose of them, but they do strongly recommend that things like even dry goods, so non-food products in similar sorts of packages, should also be disposed of. Now, the USDA does recommend that canned goods that were exposed to floodwaters be discarded as well. That's probably a pretty good recommendation for a couple of reasons. It's not easy to disinfect a can. You theory can do it. I don't know offhand how you would disinfect a label. You really can't disinfect paper. And so the labels would probably have to go. And then you have a bunch of unlabeled cans around. So just from a practical standpoint, I think most of the stock's going to have to go if it was exposed to floodwaters. And then the other thing I would comment on is even if your facility wasn't flooded, we had a lot of people with no power for quite a while. And food that may have been in a cooler or freezer that was without power for days that hadn't been cleared out, because again, getting access to some of these operations was difficult. That food may have spoiled and begun to decay in those in that equipment, and so that's going to have to be disposed of. And then you're going to have to take some special steps to make sure the equipment is safe once it's operable again, to restock with new food. So unfortunately, at the end of the day, most of this, if it's exposed to flood waters, I would just plan on pitching it.
Thank you, Dale. And I see that Kate's posted some good information from USDA, at least some guidance on, regarding food that's frozen versus food that's refrigerated, recommendations on when or how long it can be saved. But I agree with you, Dale. Oftentimes it comes down to the when in doubt, throw it out. And I also understand that in the toolkit that Shane shared with us as well, there's some information in there too. So good information out there that can hopefully help guide these food businesses. Okay, great. Moving on to getting into sort of this cleaning and disinfecting and sanitizing process. Dale, I'm going to turn it over to you, and certainly Brendan, Josh, feel free to chime in, but we'll kick it off with Dale, as I know his experience is in with chemical sanitation.
Well, I think the first step is probably, I expect Brendan and Josh have had more experience than I have with some of this, but there is a lot of debris to remove. Again, keep in mind the safety and the PPE. There may be a lot of things in here that you don't want to be messing with under the best of circumstances. I think Josh may have mentioned asbestos as a potential contaminant, and that's certainly of concern. Even once you get rid of the sort of the construction debris, you still may have, inches of mud and muck. And, that stuff is best removed with shovels to the best you can. The one thing I would say is that in preparation for the next steps, you're probably going to have to start disassembling things, shelving, racking, equipment, etc. If you can save that stuff, again, keep in mind the assessment, right? If your equipment was exposed to flood water, some of it you may just need to pitch rather than try and clean. But you're going to have to basically disassemble a lot of your equipment to get it cleaned and disinfected and sanitized. So you might as well start that process now, as long as you're getting rid of all this gross soil.
And again, once you get results back on testing, knowing there's no major hazards, again, a lot of hard surfaces can be clean. I don't really speak on the kitchen equipment, but shelving itself, if it's a hard surface and you're able to access it, most of those items can be clean. So of course, when you're going through this debris, finding those hard surface items, setting them aside for proper cleaning is very important, good for financial reasons.
Yeah, I would make the recommendation, by the time you're doing gross debris removal, bulk debris, some of it's going to be what you're going to consider your contents of your restaurant or your business equipment. So if you were to move the building, anything that you would take with you potentially could be considered a non-construction debris. While there's certainly provisions during catastrophe times to separate or to not separate building materials from just general trash, if you can bag debris, if you can separate it from construction debris versus what you want to throw away. One of the tricky things in recovery for any type of business, food, restaurants, or whatever, is who's going to pay the bill. I mean, ultimately, this all costs money. Not everyone has flood insurance. Not everyone ever prepares for a flood. So my recommendation is, regardless of when we're in the restoration business, we talk about how to restore the property, regardless of who's going to pay the bill. But if you intend on having an insurance company help you pay the bill, if there is any financing available from that, make sure you're, again, taking your photos and trying to separate things and not make your problem worse because you're hoping someone is going to help you with some insurance. If you've got a whole bunch of bulk debris and you've got equipment that's wet, you've got to get it out. You got to get it dry. Start mitigating and reducing the overall amount of damage that you could have simply from inaction. So once it's safe, take action on it. And that's just so important, especially when removing whatever you have. Try to take some photos of it. See how, like we said earlier, take it when you had it in there. Now take it out when you remove it from the building. Take photos as you go.
Now, I kind of going into our next slide, but like Josh said, taking the action as quick as possible once you know it is safe is important, just because at that point, if you don't, it's just going to amplify a lot of the microbial growth that could happen. So that's very important. Thanks for sharing that, Josh.
Yeah, I want to echo that too. Doing this as quickly as you can, because you'll start getting mold growth fairly quickly. There we go. And that's its own set of issues and concerns. So the faster you respond to this, the better off you'll be, because some stuff you're going to have to just discard again if it was exposed to flood water. Carpets, rugs, those are almost impossible to disinfect and recover. Drywall, similarly, insulation, similarly. Wood may or may not need to be replaced. If you have a drop ceiling, particularly again, if you delayed getting in there and it was wet for a long time, and you may not have had an option, right? The way roads were damaged and so on, you may not have been able to get back into a facility for weeks, in which case things like drop ceilings may need to be replaced. I would say that when you're choosing a disinfectant, we'll talk more about disinfectants in a bit, make sure you pick one that's effective against mold. Because molds are really an issue when you're doing this recovery, again, particularly if there was some time before you were able to get in and start the recovery process.
And I would also speak on, with these flood waters, we follow the standard IICRC standard for water and mold. But any flood water is considered a category 3 water. And a lot of people ask, well, what's category 3? And I think we kind of mentioned it before, but flood waters are very similar to sewage waste. So anything any drywall or, like you said, ceiling tiles, any porous material that touches these things typically, need to go. So that's something to always remember, that bag them up and get them out to the curb as fast as possible, once safe, of course.
Apart from sort of the safety issue, I will say one thing, having worked with some operations that have had some issues with floods or sewage, sometimes you have to do this just to get the funk out. Some of the odors and stuff that can remain even after it looks clean can be pretty noticeable as soon as, it may look clean, but a few days later, when it, a few months later, all of a sudden it gets warm or hot and a bit humid, and you start smelling strange stuff again. And so removing a lot of this at this point can save you trouble further down the road.
Couple of questions. So, we talk about, that assessment, it comes down to, all right, how do I know I can restore, or when do I know I just need to rebuild or replace? When we think about mold, to what degree, are we looking at before we, answer that assessment or that question of I just need to replace based on the amount of mold damage? Can you give some sort of advice, or how do we answer that question? If we see mold in our operation, how do we know what to do? Whether it be clean or replace or restore. Ice there.
So I'll start on this one. So with microbial growth that's present, if you pay attention to the small picture in this slide on this screen, that's an acoustic ceiling, drop ceiling in a building. If the flood water didn't actually get that high, then that could be secondary damage. That means that humidity got so high that mold growth started on those ceiling tiles, which means that it's going to continue to spread. Anytime you see visible mold growth, it needs to be removed. The technical side is you remove 24 inches past anything visible as kind of a rule of thumb anyway. When it comes to building materials, drywall, ceiling tiles, there's no cleaning it. It needs to come out. One, even as good as the tools are that restoration professionals and building professionals have, we can't see inside walls. We have thermal imaging. We use moisture meters to read relative humidity and temperature and moisture content of materials. The bottom line is, if you can see it, you need to go ahead and remove it. Discard it, bag it, and remove it. It's ideal for a person that is certified and trained in removal of mold growth to handle that. What it does specifically is reduce the amount of secondary contamination that you could have. If it's in a dining room and you do it improperly, you can have now spread it to any unaffected area of the building.
Yeah, this is one of those areas where you might want to, if you can get some help with this, an expert. I think Josh is right to help make some of this assessment. And you trying to disinfect some of these surfaces, even if it looks like the mold is gone, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's gone. One of the things people tend to use a lot during these sorts of recoveries is chlorine-based disinfectants, which work great. But one of the kind of side things that they do is they will bleach. Basically, they make it so that you don't see the mold anymore. They'll bleach the color out of them, which is a problem because it may not actually kill all the mold. It just makes it so as you can't see it. And then what's going to happen is as soon as it gets humid again, you can have the mold basically showing right back up again. So, this is one where I think Josh nailed it exactly. If you can see it, it's got to go.
Right. So you brought up bleach. I understand that probably any outside non-professional resource is going to mention using some type of sodium hypochlorite or bleach or something in their cleaning process. And Dale, I know that you have said 30 times yesterday, you hadn't said it yet today, but you will. We have to apply whatever it is from the label. And you've got to, so bleach, and any type of sanitation and disinfectant that may be in a food safe industry will indeed clean food-borne or bacteria from a solid hard surface, which in a restaurant or food facility is NSF rated. That product is rated to remove and sanitize a hard metal surface or a hard cleanable surface. Many of the products that we're using are EPA registered that can be applied to semi-porous items and have come with a process of remove this, use this product with a dwell time. So some of the products that we're using have the ability to not only sanitize against bacteria, but virus and microbial growth, and then help in the cleaning process. So there is a little bit of a difference. And oftentimes if you can overuse bleach, or if you're gonna use bleach, use it by the recommended label. If you're using a 10-to-1, stronger is not always better, but what it can do is it can react with a different product that you may want to try cleaning with and end up with a whole scenario of chemical reactions and people getting sick because you tried to clean with multiple products. So when it comes to it, source removal is going to be key. Start with removing whatever you can that you couldn't salvage to start with.
Now, I'd like to add, anytime you're doing any type of cleaning, making sure you have the proper ventilation. Again, because there have been some really bad situations where people mean to do good and help out and people are getting sick. So anytime, get the proper airflow in there any way you can.
And I get that bleach is kind of popular for a variety of reasons. It's cheap, it's readily available, and it kind of makes things smell clean. But there's some issues with it too. To Josh's point, it can be extremely hazardous if you mix it with the wrong chemicals. Good examples is if you mix it with ammonia, or if you mix it with an acid, you can generate chlorine gas, which is extremely toxic. It's downright deadly to people. You will also find that bleach can corrode a lot of surfaces. So you can, if misused, do a lot of damage. And again, I'll probably say this a number of times, but you have to use this stuff according to the label. More does not necessarily work better. If you're using this these sorts of disinfectants and sanitizers according to the label, it'll kill the microorganisms, and you can't kill them dead or dead. And so using more doesn't help and frequently hurts.
Excellent information. I think we're going to get into a deeper conversation on those chemicals and the proper use of those chemicals as well. One of you mentioned the concept of testing. You know, is there any suggestions or guidance, or what would you say about testing your air handling units, or even just your air within your food establishment for molds or other microorganisms? Any comments on that as far as testing goes?
I guess my comment is that's kind of a specialized capability. Now, not everybody's going to have access to that. One of the things that I tend to do in a situation like this is, again, if you can see mold, assume that mold's in the air. Frankly, mold's always in the air. Assume the microbes are always in the air, and take appropriate precautions. But to actually test the surfaces for microorganisms, that involves pulling samples and some specialized equipment to test them, or sending them out to a laboratory for analysis. It's such a difficult process. In this case, in all honesty, I guess I would just assume sort of the worst case and operate according to that. Assume that the molds and pathogens are going to be there. Yeah, particularly molds that you see them, right? If you see them, you know it's there. But even other things, like if you go into an HVAC system, offhand, I don't know how you could easily test that without having some very specialized skills and equipment and capabilities. Best bet's probably just to assume that it's contaminated and clean appropriately.
Yeah, I would definitely agree and reiterate the fact that if you can see it, it's there. If you're wanting to do testing, the amount of testing facilities and labs are going to be so limited at this time. I would, if you're trying to get testing, perhaps it's after post remediation, after everything is out and you are trying to see, did you get it all? Have you already cleaned? That may be a time to try to take a few samples and understand that it's going to be a delay. Just the amount of resources aren't there to test everything. If you can see it, just assume it. That is not the case with asbestos. You can't just always say, well, I'm sure it is, or I'm sure it's not. A building that's 120 years old may be completely free, and a building that was built in 1995 may be hot. So you can't always assume it. That's one thing we can't assume.
Great points.
And I would say on the asbestos testing, there's surveyors throughout North Carolina. I'm pretty sure North Carolina Department of Health handles that regulating the who's licensed. So maybe they could help you with that if you're looking for someone as well. And there's many IEPs throughout the Carolinas. I know they are going to be super busy, but if that's something you're looking forward to, I'm pretty sure Department of Health can get you in the right, give you a number for one of those companies as well, or we can as well. I know me and Josh work with many of them as well, and probably Dale has contacts too. So I think our contacts will be shown later. So if you're needing help finding someone for either of those testing, please reach out and we'll be happy to connect you.
That's right.
Yeah, definitely. We'll definitely be sharing your contact information.
Bringing up the heat and air systems, air conveyance. Sometimes you can clean, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can only clean partials. The NADCA is a great resource for determining what could and should be cleaned. Anytime you have a system shut down, humidity that may be in there, if the ductwork is insulated on the interior, it could be insulated on the exterior. It could have flexible ductwork. The systems may be down. So companies that specialize in duct cleaning can clean, and no different than anything that's in the whole facility. You have to take into consideration the cost of replacement versus restoration. It just may not make any sense to clean it in the grand scheme of things. It may just be better to replace it. If you can't get it in and you can safely get it tested and clean it, then that may be your best route. But sometimes the replacement may be your most cost-effective method in the end.
Great, Josh. And you mentioned an acronym there, NAGDA. Can you spell that out for us, just for our
NADCA is National Air Duct Cleaners Association.
Great. Excellent. Definitely add that to our resource page that will provide the audience. All right, moving on from clean now to actually decreasing the presence of microorganisms, getting into sanitizing and disinfecting. So let's get into that, Dale. You want to kick us off there? What things to think about when we go beyond that gross soil removal?
Yeah. So once you kind of get the debris and the majority of the mud out and everything, the next step is to start cleaning. You need to clean with a good heavy duty cleaner. You need to use some mechanical actions. When I worked for a chemical company, my colleagues in the sales department always used to hate it when I would say this, but sometimes one of the best cleaners is elbow grease. So scrub. You have to disassemble everything you haven't already taken apart to get into all the nooks and crannies. After you've applied the detergent and you've scrubbed, you then have to rinse, and you have to rinse with potable water, right? And you're going to need a fairish bit of it to rinse all the soil away. And you just have to keep doing this, frankly, until everything is clean. We talked a moment ago about testing, and there are some tests, but they're non-trivial to me. And what the food code always says about cleaning is it's sort of clean to the Mark 1 eyeball and finger. It looks and feels clean, smells clean. Generally, you want to clean from the top down. And after you've cleaned, after a flood, you want to disinfect. Now, I want to emphasize disinfect at this point and not sanitize. Disinfectants and sanitizers are not interchangeable. Okay, they're different chemicals. You have to read the labels on these. Most of the cleaners and disinfectants you'll probably end up using are probably concentrates that you'll have to dilute. Dilute them to the recommended concentration. More is not necessarily better, and it's oftentimes worse. And again, make sure that disinfectant that you're choosing does say disinfectant. Make sure that you use it according to label instructions. It is good to have one that is effective against molds. The labels will list the organisms that it will kill, and make sure there's some molds on there. It will say if it's effective against viruses like hepatitis and those kinds of things. Probably not a bad idea to look for that too. And then the final thing to look for with disinfectants in particular is a dwell time. These chemicals don't work immediately. They have to remain on the surface, and that means the surfaces that you're trying to disinfect have to remain wet with the disinfectant for that dwell time. That dwell time may be a minute, it may be 10 minutes, it may be somewhere in between. It'll all be on the label. This is one of those times where you just need to sit down with the label or with the bottle of product and read that label and use it according to the label instructions, in particular that dwell time. And then when all that's done, rinse it with potable water again to get rid of all the disinfectant after that dwell time is done.
Great, Dale. And a bit about the label. You know, oftentimes there's the label on, say, a bottle of bleach or whatever, but oftentimes we may not see instructions for food contact surfaces or for the surface that we're trying to disinfect. Can you give some advice on what to do when it seems like the label is incomplete or isn't targeting the surface that you're disinfecting?
At this point, you're not terribly worried about food contact versus non-food contact surfaces. We'll kind of deal with food contact surfaces with the next step. And many disinfectants may not call out food contact surfaces. What they'll talk about are hard surfaces. So that's metal, tile, plastic, you know, Formica tabletops, those kinds of things. Generally, it doesn't include things like wood, carpet, right? Those are considered largely soft or porous surfaces. So hard, non-porous surfaces. and the label will generally state hard, non-porous surface. It will be on there. If in doubt, any label is going to have a phone number or contact information for the manufacturer of the chemical. You know, if you've gone to Home Depot or Lowe's or something and picked up a bucket of disinfectant, there will be a label on there with contact information. Reach out to them. Some of the contact information at the end of this webinar will be my contact information, as well as contact information for some people with other chemical companies. Reach out to any of them for advice. Brendan and Josh know this stuff real well too from their work. So if in doubt, ask somebody. Again, look for some help and read the label. It should be on the label. The EPA regulates those pretty tightly, and they require certain information like that to be on these labels.
Yeah, oftentimes we've encountered where there's a website given that you can find more information on that complete label and those complete instructions as well.
Yeah. You can a lot of times find more information on the chemical manufacturer's website, but for the most part, the bottle label should be reasonably complete. But sometimes you may have to do a little bit of digging, particularly something like bleach, which may have a relatively short label on the bottle. You may have to go to a website for more information. But for many disinfectants, it will be on the label. And again, go to the manufacturer. They'll be able to answer any other questions you have.
No, a lot of the suppliers as well. Anytime me and Josh have a question, we have people in the industry we reach out to that supply these chemicals, and they're a wealth of knowledge, and a lot of them have done the work themselves before getting into that industry. So, you know, if you have a lot of these questions, please reach out to Dell, myself, and Josh, and we can definitely get you in touch with these manufacturers and suppliers of these products.
Right. I agree. So with the cleaning and disinfecting, because I understand the sanitize at the end. Remember that any of this equipment was originally designed for the end user to be able to clean it, to maintain its cleanliness, to operate in a food-based area. That has nothing to do with the fact that water rose up and got water around a motor, or it was running and it drew terribly filthy air or debris across the motors and in through the filters and in parts of the equipment that you would not have seen. So sometimes cleaning is not only on the exterior. You may have to take them apart and work on all surfaces. And the elbow grease, that's a great thing, because you cannot have a substitution for it. If you want to use the analogy, and I'm going to have to give my son credit for this, I used to teach about cleaning and just spraying the disinfectant. And I said, well, would you go to a public restroom and only spray chemicals on a toilet and then wipe your hand across it? He said, you know, Dad, you could have said the same thing about a car that goes to a car wash. And I said, point taken, I'll start using that as an example, but no different. You can run your car through a car wash with high pressure spray and it still not be clean. Just the bulk stuff got off of it. There's no substitute for the hand cleaning and the wiping. for anything. There's no spray and pray method that will work on anything that's dealing with these types of ulcers.
Yeah,
Very
such good
true.
information.
And to add something that Josh sort of touched on, when you're to this point of the recovery, this is a good point if you're an operator to bring back in the people who may be regularly cleaning this equipment, right? Because you're doing this cleaning and sanitation on a day-to-day basis when you're in normal operation, if you're a restaurant or any kind of food operation. The people who are doing that regularly, your staff, are the ones who probably know best already some of the ways to clean this. This is a great opportunity to bring them in and use some of the opportunities, use some of the expertise that your own staff may have on helping you to clean some of this equipment that they may have been cleaning already for years.
Great, great. Such good information. I'm going to move forward with sort of this third step. We've simply broken it down into 3 steps, if you will. But now considering, we've talked about disinfecting, now moving on to this concept of sanitizing.
One of the things I would recommend actually before you go on to the true sanitation is that you repeat step 2. Clean and disinfect again. When something's been exposed to floodwaters, I think it's best to err on the side of caution. And even though you may have thought you did a great job, just do it again. It's going to be minimal effort compared to the headaches that you can get if you don't do this well. After that, so you've done that final rinse after your repeat of step 2, then you sanitize at least food contact surfaces. You have to sanitize the food contact surfaces. The health departments aren't going to let you open up again unless you've sanitized those food contact surfaces. Frankly, I would resanitize everything. Again, sanitizers are different than disinfectants. So to do this, you want to use a sanitizer. The one you normally use in a restaurant operation or food service operation is fine. And remember, after you've sanitized, you don't rinse that, right? You just give it that 1 minute contact time. So again, it stays wet for 1 minute, let it drain and air dry. Anything at this point that you've disassembled, you can reassemble it. Remember, that's all been cleaned, disinfected twice, and then rinsed and sanitized. After you've reassembled everything, I like to sanitize it again in case something somehow got contaminated during the reassembly process. And then, at that point, you've done pretty much, I think, everything you can. If you were going to do any testing, this might be the time to consider it. Again, I would talk to your health department partners and see what they think. Again, if they've hopefully been along this journey with you, they'll be confident that you're ready to go too, and you may not need to do that, to do any testing. Again, that's one of the reasons I think it's very useful to partner with your local health department along this whole journey.
Yeah, and I'll reiterate, what Dale and Josh and Brendan have said, go back to that label and understand the differences in that contact time or the concentration of that chemical that you'll be using, be it at the disinfectant level or at the sanitization level. Great points, Dale. Anything else to add here on just our, sort of 3-step not simple, but we've simplified it down into 3 steps, but removal of that gross soil, disinfectant, followed by sanitization, particularly of those food contact surfaces. Anything to add or any questions from our audience members? Great. Lots of good information there.
Hi. So sorry.
Corinne.
Hi, this is Corinne from Wawa Food Markets. Great presentation so far. I just had a question in terms of cleaning for mold. So back in my health department days, we would talk about concern with aerosolizing the mold spores when you're using like a spray bottle or a lot of times people want to use a power washer and jump in with that. Is there any information that you might be able to share in that regard? Is that a concern or something we should be aware of?
Yep. Power washers, particularly if you use them kind of late in the process, you can aerosolize material with something like a power washer. The issue is when you use those, it'll probably be fairly early in the process when it may be safe to assume you already got all the gunk in the world in the air, and you're really just using that for gross soil removal. By the time you get to sort of this end sanitization process, sanitizing, you're really not going to want to use a power washer to apply a sanitizer. You know, and that's one of the reasons that you go through and you disinfect and sanitize almost everything after you've done that initial cleaning, because during that cleaning process, even doing, you know, the hand scrubbing, power washing, you will create aerosols and you will spread stuff around. It's one of the reasons we tend to go from top to bottom as well to help control that somewhat. And then you apply the disinfectant to essentially everything and the sanitizer to everything, to help address some of the possibility that you may have spread some contamination around during that cleaning process.
I would also say when you're speaking of microbial growth, when we're cleaning it, a lot of times creating chambers too with poly. So if you have a small area, you can create a chamber, and that will help kind of keep it contained to that area when you are doing the removal of it or bulk removal of it. And again, we use negative air machines to create negative pressure. I doubt everyone has access to those, but hey, before I knew what I knew now, you know, you can create a lot of cool negative air flow with fans, a box fan. So, you know, as long as you're getting that out a window and then, you know, have some fresh air coming in as well. So there's ways to get creative with it if you do have access to poly and tape and those kind of things.
Something else to watch for, and I almost hate to have to mention this, is you will occasionally find that unfortunately situations like this can sometimes bring out the worst. And one of the things that can bring out is snake oil. I know during COVID, we saw an awful lot of snake oil out there. You know, claims that were very dubious around methods of application of disinfectants. A lot of processes that just were not particularly good or effective, but may on the surface have looked promising. Be a bit careful, and if in doubt, utilize some of the contact information that we're going to give you here in a moment, and reach out to them to ask, you know, to us, to some of the other contact information we'll have, to ask their thoughts. And so do be a bit careful of that. I haven't seen any real evidence of that after Helene, but I have seen it in other instances.
I would say too, what Josh brought up, pictures. You know, it's amazing what we can do with our phones now between FaceTime and photos. You know, reach out to your contacts, and you know, many of us be happy to answer any questions if you can get us the proper photos or video too. So,
yep. Vacuums are a great source of any loose debris. I'd reiterate what both Dale and Brennan said. By the time you're trying to actually wash it down, your loose debris should be up. Water on top of dry soil is mud, and it's a lot easier to vacuum up a little bit of loose dirt and try to get mud off of something. And I'd use that in jest is vacuuming it. You've removed the source. If you had a whole bunch of dust, you're vacuuming the dust into a container and you're disposing of it in a negative pressure manner. So that way you're not, by the time you are cleaning, or even a minor spray bottle is not going to disperse enough pressure. But vacuuming is a great way to remove a lot of your bulk debris to reduce it being spread.
Super, super helpful, all of that. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Great. There was some comments about resources, and that's actually our very next slide here is a reminder on, you know, reach out for help. As Dale mentioned, you know, contact those individuals who are experts in this area. We have our contact information for our experts during this discussion for Dale, Brendan, as well as Josh. And we've also included some contact information from sanitation companies. As Brendan mentioned, reach out to the chemical suppliers. They are the experts in that field. And so we have a couple of people as well mentioned here. David Buckley from Diversey, a Salinas company, as well as Ecolab, both Jill Hollingsworth as well as Gina Owen. And thank you, Kate. She's been offering or providing some resources in the chat and those links to assistance from our U.S. government. as well as the Institute of Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration certification. A lot of good information there as to where can I find help? They actually have search sites that you can enter in your location, your zip code, and you can find a restoration company. And then, of course, as Shane mentioned, our North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services provides a toolkit with a plethora of good information in getting your food business back and running. And I want to open it back up to Dale, Brendan, Josh. Any last comments or words of advice that you have for the audience?
I guess I would say just reach out for help when you need it. Everybody on here, I think, are North Carolina locals. The Diversey folk are in Charlotte, Ecolab folk are in Greensboro. I'm in Western North Carolina. I live in Highlands. We're all relatively local and able to help however we can. You're not alone in this process. So reach out and we will help however we can.
Yeah, I'd like to second that as well. Reach out for the help, but also, again, don't take chances and put safety first. I know we're all eager to get things back and running, but safety always comes first. And thank you for allowing us to speak on it.
Of course.
I appreciate the time, and I echo the safety part of things. Sometimes the best thing that you can do is slow down to speed up.
Great advice, and thank you all for joining us. We have recorded this conversation. We will be providing this as a resource, as well as the copy of these slides and links to the information that we've shared on our extension portal website. And Kate has just included that in the chat. Thanks so much, Kate. All this information can be found there. If you know of someone that this information might help, we welcome you to share that info or share this with them as well. I can't thank our experts enough. Brendan, Josh, Dale, thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise. Really appreciate the value that you brought to the conversation today. And with that, I wish everyone a good day, and our thoughts as well as our prayers are certainly with those in Western North Carolina. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.